By. So you'll have heard me making reference numerous times at meetings in the last couple of months to this mythical report that we were writing on Right to Buy. Now, as you know, because you've all seen us on the committee, we've had a number of sessions on this in order to get under the skin of it. And in between those meetings, there's been a number of other different events and meetings and work that's been going on in order to produce this report. And now you will see that the draft is in our papers for tonight's meeting. So the purpose of this session is, I suppose, first of all for me and for Tom, who's also involved in the writing of the report. As you know, when we did this in our work programme at the start of the year, we agreed that this would be a joint piece of work between OST and the Housing Scrutiny Committee. So the draft that you have in front of you, as well as having taken into account the contributions that people around this table have made over the course of the scrutiny, the draft was put into play by myself and by Tom and by Eleanor Kerslake, who is on the committee. But I'm told also views from the Housing Scrutiny Committee were taken into account in bringing this together as well. This is a draft now, it's not a final report, so I would hope that we can develop it further before we have a final version that goes to Cabinet. I would, inviting more views and more ideas about the recommendations that we have. I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think the report that we have at the moment is a really strong piece of work and does have a number of recommendations that I think are important in the way that the borough adapts to the possibility of this piece of legislation. I think it also does a good job of making clear the huge threat that the Housing and Planning Bill, and specifically Right to Buy for housing association and the forced sale of void properties has for our borough, the threat that it has to the house building programme that we've been discussing this evening, in terms of the financial modelling as well. So I'm not going to go through the whole report. I'm assuming, as we're all intelligent adults, that people will have been able to have read it already. I would like to highlight some specific recommendations. Tom's going to cover 6 to 8, which is the area he concentrated on in the drafting, which is the housing associations in Southwark section. The ones I would just highlight, the most important for me is the fact that we do need to do an urgent review of the financial modelling that underpins the 11,000 homes. We need to, obviously, there's a huge commitment there to build those homes. It's absolutely essential that happens. And if, as a result of changes in national legislation, we need to adapt in order to make that happen, I think we need to do that urgently, and it shouldn't be something that we let drift because the changes involved are massive. Obviously, the obvious one is that if we are forced to sell homes that we wouldn't have otherwise sold, that undermines the financial modelling in terms of the amount we can borrow and the rent that's coming in, etc., etc., etc. So that's recommendation 1. I would also point you to, under the heading the forced sale of council homes, the recommendation 3, which is to ensure that we as a council know absolutely what is excluded from those forced sales of properties. What it's a developing situation because the bill is still currently going through Parliament. We don't know exactly what its final form is going to be, so it's a bit difficult to be specific at this particular time. But I've said there the list should be extensive, wide-ranging, as is legally permissible, and should include such things as newly built properties, sheltered housing, properties with TMA. We don't know yet whether or not we can include all of those, but we're hopeful that there will be some list of exclusions, and as soon as we get it, we move on to that. There's also the point about, obviously, the council will be forced to sell homes at the point that they become void. Now, clearly, there must be actions that the council can take in order to stop those voids from occurring in the first place. If we take an entirely passive role, the voids will just come up, but there is action that the council can take in order to stop them coming up in the first place, and that needs to be looked at very, very closely. And also, it's our policies that define a void, right? So it is not entirely clear there's no objective definition of what a void is, how many days, what's the length of time that it becomes vacant, in what way is it transferred to a new tenant, those kind of things, and that needs to be looked at very closely. I'll jump over the house associations bit that Tom is going to look at, and go to recommendation 9, which is so that council undertakes preliminary work to determine the potential impact of mortgage defaults on the borough's temporary housing and homelessness services. There's going to be knock-on effects from this policy, and we need to make sure that we're on top of that, and mortgage defaults obviously would be a massive part of that. And then 10, the council, in collaboration with housing associations, works with local financial inclusion and debt charities to educate those considering right to buy on the impact of moving into home ownership. We know from our own experience of right to buy on council properties that often people make those decisions without the full facts in front of them, or indeed even when they do sometimes have them in front of them, they don't necessarily look into it as much as they should, and as a result they make the wrong decision and find that they're not able to afford those repayments when they come up. And I think it's absolutely vital that the council makes sure that as many people as possible have the maximum amount of information. There's a number of recommendations there on external communications, including 11, which is that we actually have a communications plan around these changes. I think that's absolutely essential. I'll draw your attention to recommendation 15, which is about the leader of the council or cabinet member writing to the chair of the Communities and Local Government Select Committee in order to offer this borough up as an example. I'm pretty sure that committee is going to be looking into this very soon. We do have a Southwark MP on that committee in Helen Hayes, and I think it's very important that we do engage with that, because I think the way that inner London boroughs like Southwark are affected is very different to the way that other local authorities are affected in different parts of the country, and I don't think that is fully clear to all members of Parliament who are obviously going to be voting on this in due course. So Tom, I'll just hand over to you quickly on the housing association stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. So it's recommendations 6, 7 and 8. So 6 is about discussions with housing associations who are planning future homes in Southwark. And as is mentioned there, Peter mentioned at Council Assembly last week that L&Q has been designated as a pilot by DCLG. So we're going to see very quickly the expressions of interest from residents that are L&Q tenants in Southwark. So we're going to have some early data and we want to work with the housing associations for them to share that with us and for us to look at the effects that might have. Recommendation 7 is more about profile. We heard from housing association managers that they, under these proposals, they may seek to change the profile of developments. That's creating more homes for sale and fewer for rent in Southwark. And we would ask the council to speak to housing associations and for them to give us notice if changes are occurring. And 8, there are a number of issues around impact of right to buy. From our discussions with housing associations, we have felt that they aren't fully aware of the implications of right to buy. We think Southwark has learnt a lot from right to buy since it was introduced in the 80s, and we're asking that the council share information with them. For example, there is little evidence that housing associations understand the income profile of their tenants and the possibility that they'll be able to afford to buy their homes in Southwark. There are issues around the initial surge that we saw in the 80s, where it's all very well looking at current demand for right to buy, but actually in the early stage of right to buy there was a massive surge in year 2. Year 1 was only a very short period, but in year 2 there was a massive number of applications. So it might be that they haven't factored that in properly, and we didn't get any sense that they were expecting a surge. Finally, is tenant expectations. So one housing association made it very clear to us that tenants who buy, were effectively no longer their responsibility. And Southwark has a long history of dealing with leaseholders, not always in positive circumstances, and we hoped that the council would talk to housing associations about the difficulties of those relationships and the issues around expectation of tenants moving from being tenants where they can request repairs to their properties and so on, to being leaseholders themselves and responsible for that stuff.
Yeah, just on that final point, the quote that Tom's referring to is on page 38 of the supplemental agenda. I was in the room when the chief executive of the housing association said this, and I was quite taken aback with the tone in which it was said is similar to how it looks on paper, which is, we're going to make it crystal clear to our tenants who are going to write the minute they buy they are on their own, and then a little later on said, we're no longer interested in repairs in the home, I'm only interested in my community areas, don't come to me complaining about your neighbours or anything like that, don't come to me saying what this is, about this or about that, I'm not interested. And I think there's a lot of people who may be considering right to buy who won't be aware of that may be the attitude. I don't think that's uniform, but brutally she was making the case for what does sometimes happen when people go for right to buy and their relationship changes with the housing association. So they are the recommendations. That's the report. I hope people have had the chance to read it. Welcome any contributions, suggested changes, anything that people want to say. So I've had a Nude and then David.
Thanks, Chair. It's really good. Well done, Tom. Really good. One sort of broad point is just, I'm not, and I speak for my group, not completely against right to buy in principle. Actually, people who've exercised the right to buy and live in our borough and contribute and stuff. So I just think we should be a bit careful about the principle, and both of our parties, when in government, haven't got rid of right to buy. So I just think there's a broad point. The problem we've got here is about the way it's being funded and the fact that it's not going to be replaced, and certainly not replaced in the right areas. So I think it's important that we're clear about that and that they're our concerns. And then just three specifics. One is about the voids thing. Obviously, the council currently does sell off voids if they're worth over 500 grand and they're in significant need of repair, and that's been a party political battle. And we were pleased when Labour moved the threshold from 300 grand to 500 grand last year. I would actually ask that that's reviewed as part of this process, just to see how many are being sold there, because I think it's important if we start lecturing other people who are looking at voids rules that we actually just check our own houses in order and what we're doing there, so we don't look like the council is being hypocritical in any way. So I would ask that we somewhere include reviewing our own voids threshold.
I'm sure policies. We could find a form of words in the existing recommendation that made that was included.
Thank you.
As part of it.
Cool. And then I've got two other specifics. One is really concerned to hear companies are now going out putting leaflets through people's letterboxes saying, don't worry if you can't afford to do the right to buy, we'll do it for you. Yeah. And there must be something we can do to speak to those companies, whether it makes any difference or not, but a formal letter from the council saying stop going around trying to exploit people you mean. Okay. So I think if we can somehow have a recommendation that the council at least engages with those companies and tries to point out to them quite how unscrupulous they're being. And finally, I mean, the report talks about the difficulties of replacing right to buy sales at all in Southwark, but I do think we actually ought to be pushing a bit more and saying we want them replaced in the area where they're sold, because one of the things we all love about Southwark is that we have mixed communities, and actually you can see if it's all sold in one area, the most expensive areas are not replaced. So I just think we're talking about we want to make sure stuff's replaced within Southwark, but actually we want it to be replaced within the areas where it's sold. Whether that's community council area or just roughly, but something that's a bit more specific, given it's a large borough and community is very different across the borough.
On that final point, I think on the other points, I think no problem on the first point you made. The second point about engaging with the companies and putting the leaflets through, yes, I agree with that. On that final point, I mean that's a view, but that's not specifically about this issue, is it? I mean.
It's just the report talks about replacements, so I just thought it was, the report talks about how desirable it is that they're replaced in Southwark, and I just thought somewhere, I can find you a specific place to insert it, if that's helpful. Yeah.
Well, send me that, and we'll take a look at it. I suppose the point I'm making is the replacement points that are made in this report and in the recommendations are about a response to what is happening at government level. Tom and then Dave, welcome to you.
Yeah, just
I'm sure you've
Things on this specific.
There you go. I'll let you off.
Tom, David, your only question tonight has come up with a recommendation, so you're 100%. So I'm waiting with bated breath. Tom.
It's a point actually on the second point from the nude about companies putting leaflets in our books. I have always wondered around trespass and whether or not they have the right to be in our blocks in the first place. I don't know if I know it's standard. Lots of people go in and out of blocks delivering leaflets. Maybe we can stop some other people.
This is awkward.
I do wonder about
We're
commercial
also talking about
companies.
housing associations, so the council may not have. We can't stop them necessarily going into housing association blocks.
But I
You're
think
going
if we
up.
were stifling them at our end, because at the moment that's where they're making their money before they start to get into housing associations. I don't know, I'm just wondering.
About
Have
the
to think
pizza
about
leaflets.
Yeah.
We no more pizzas.
David.
I don't know if it's something we should be considering or not, but on recommendation 16 about continuing to contribute to lobby efforts from membership of London Council, Central London Forward, my understanding is, and some of the members might be more up-to-date than me, that some councils were considering taking legal action against the government, and I just wonder whether we should be potentially strengthening that recommendation, including, to consider financially or getting involved with other councils in a legal challenge.
Well, maybe there's something there
contributing
about
financially or
taking legal
something,
advice. I mean, presumably, if a council or councils are taking legal action, that there will be opportunity to do that as a group. I would think, for council, it doesn't seem to make sense for one council on its own to do that. But I would like to look into that a little bit more. I must admit, I don't know much about that particular issue, so.
No,
I'll
I'm
look
not
into
completely
it.
up to date, but I think if that is the case, then I think Southwark should be lining up with those other councils.
Okay. Okay. What I propose to do practically on this is, as with previous reports, is for me to go back and make some changes, consult further, get the report out there a little bit as well, and then make some changes, and then send a track changed version to OSC in order to get it agreed prior to the next meeting. So we don't have to wait a whole month or longer than a month and a half in order to get this to Cabinet. I would like this to go to Cabinet as soon as possible. So what I'd suggest is you task me, I'm tasking myself, to go make these changes, consult a little bit further if we can, and then just without having to have another meeting, send it to Cabinet. Are people relatively happy with that process? We can basically consult via email. Helen, did you want to come in?
It doesn't matter actually.
You sure? Okay. Any other contributions on that? Okay, so on that basis, can we agree to move forward and get the report to Cabinet?
Yeah.
Drop it down.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So we're